Prepare to delve into a story that defies reason and reveals the darkest side of human nature. Today we'll explore a mystery that has endured for over a century without answers, a story that was deliberately erased from official records as if it never happened. Before we begin, let us know where you're joining us from on this journey into the unknown. The year was 1902. The northern Appalachian mountains stood like silent guardians of secrets that preferred to remain buried. We were in West Virginia, a region where deep valleys and dense forests created a natural isolation between communities. It was a time when industrialization was beginning to transform some cities, but vast tracts of land still remained virtually untouched by modernity. The families inhabiting these mountainous regions lived simply, relying on subsistence farming, hunting, and small local businesses. That autumn, the leaves painted the landscape with hues of red, orange, and gold. The air carried that characteristic chill that heralded the arrival of the harsh Appalachian winter. It was in this setting that the Hollowbrook family maintained their property, a modest farm located approximately 15 kilometers from the nearest town, Harper's Mill. The property sat in a natural depression between two hills, protected from the strongest winds, but also hidden from prying eyes. To reach it, one had to follow a dirt road that wound between centuries-old pines and oaks. The Hollowbrooks were not unknown in the area. Thomas Hollowbrook, the patriarch, was a man of medium height and reserved temperament. He had arrived in the area about 8 years earlier, accompanied by his wife, Margaret, and quickly established himself as a hard-working farmer. Although not exactly sociable, they maintained cordial relations with their closest neighbors. Thomas visited Harper's Mill every 2 or 3 weeks to sell farm produce and purchase essential supplies. Margaret was occasionally seen at the local church, always dressed simply but appropriately, her brown hair tied back in a traditional bun. The Hollowbrook property grew primarily corn and potatoes, and they raised a few pigs and chickens. Nothing extraordinary by the standards of the time. The house was a 2-story wooden structure with a front porch and a stone chimney that belched smoke during the cold months. There was a modest-sized barn, a well-kept fence, and a well with crystal-clear water. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, perfectly normal. It was exactly the kind of property you'd expect to find in that mountainous region of West Virginia in the early 20th century. The closest neighbors, the Hutchins family, lived about 2 miles away. Samuel Hutchins later reported that Thomas was a man of few words, but always polite. Occasionally, the two would exchange tools or help each other during the harvest. Margaret had visited Mrs. Hutchins a few times, usually to exchange recipes or borrow an ingredient. These were normal interactions, the kind that occurred between rural neighbors in those days. Nothing that aroused suspicion or drew special attention. The autumn of 1902 was like any other. The crops were being harvested, winter preparations were underway, and life followed its predictable rhythm. Then something began to change. In early October of that year, Thomas Hollowbrook made his last recorded visit to Harper's Mill. The local merchant, a man named Elijah Porter, would later recall that Thomas had purchased an unusual quantity of provisions: flour, salt, dried meat, kerosene, and other items that seemed to last several months. When Porter commented on the quantity, Thomas simply replied that he preferred to be prepared for the harsh winter ahead. Nothing major, apparently. Many families stocked up generously before winter, especially those living more isolated. Porter sold the goods, noted the credit in his ledger, and bid farewell to Thomas, who departed with his loaded wagon. It was the last time anyone at Harper's Mill saw Thomas Hollowbrook. But at that moment, no one had reason to suspect anything was amiss. Winter was known to keep rural families isolated on their properties for weeks or even months, so Thomas's absence would not have been immediately noticed. October gave way to November, and November brought with it the first snowfalls. The northern Appalachian region was transformed into a blanket of white, with temperatures dropping dramatically and roads becoming virtually impassable. Families retreated to their homes, keeping fires burning day and night, telling stories and waiting for spring to return. It was a period of natural isolation, where communication between distant properties became extremely difficult. Smoke rising from chimneys was often the only visible sign that a family was still safe in their distant home. Samuel Hutchins noticed sometime in December that he hadn't seen smoke coming from the Hollowbrooks' chimney for several days. This was unusual considering the intense cold. However, the snow was too deep for him to drive to the neighboring property just to check. He mentioned it to his wife, who suggested that perhaps the Hollowbrooks had gone to spend the winter with relatives elsewhere. It was a reasonable explanation, though neither of them really knew if the Hollowbrooks had family elsewhere. In any case, with the snow blocking the roads, there wasn't much they could do at that point. The winter of 1902 to 1903 was particularly harsh. Temperatures remained below freezing for weeks at a time, and snowpack reached record heights. Several families in the region faced hardship, with some losing parts of their livestock to the extreme cold. It was the kind of winter that became legend, one people would talk about for decades. When spring finally arrived in March 1903, it was as if the entire land breathed a sigh of relief. The snow began to melt, the streams began to flow freely again, and the roads, though muddy, became passable again. It was then that Samuel Hutchins decided to check on his neighbors. He saddled his horse and set off along the trail that led to the Hollowbrooks property on a clear March morning. As he approached, an eerie silence descended. No animal sounds, no visible movement. The house remained standing, seemingly intact, but there was something unsettling about the absolute stillness. Samuel tied his horse and walked cautiously toward the front door. He knocked, called out for the Hollowbrooks, but received no answer. He tried the doorknob and found it unlocked. What Samuel found inside that house would change his life forever and begin one of the most perplexing mysteries in Appalachian history. But to fully understand the impact of this discovery and what happened next, we must first understand the social and legal context of that region at that particular time. Local authorities were limited, communication between counties was slow, and investigative resources were scarce. We are talking about a time before many modern forensic techniques, where justice relied heavily on testimony and basic physical evidence. The Hollowbrook house was empty, completely empty. Samuel Hutchins walked through the rooms with growing bewilderment, finding something that defied all logic. There was no furniture, no clothes, no kitchen utensils. The walls were bare, the wood stove remained cold, and a thin layer of dust covered the wooden floor. It was as if no one had ever lived there. Samuel knew the house. He had been there before on cordial visits. He clearly remembered the dining table in the kitchen, the carved wooden chairs, the curtains in the windows. Now none of that existed. He climbed the creaking stairs to the second floor, where the bedrooms were. Empty, absolutely empty. Not even a bed, not a wardrobe, not a trunk. The windows were closed but not locked. And when Samuel looked through them into the yard, he noticed that the barn too looked abandoned. He quickly descended and made his way there. The barn door was ajar, swinging gently in the spring wind. Inside, the same scene repeated itself. No tools, no farm equipment, no sign of the animals the Hollowbrooks surely owned. Even the straw that normally lined the barn floor had been removed. Samuel stood there for long minutes, trying to process what he was seeing. An entire family doesn't simply disappear, taking absolutely everything with them, including heavy furniture, in the middle of the harshest winter in decades. It would be physically impossible to transport such a large amount of belongings across snow-covered roads. And even if it were possible, why would anyone do it? Why not simply lock up the house and leave, leaving their belongings behind like any sensible person would? Questions swirled in his mind, unable to find satisfactory answers. He rode back to his property and reported everything to his wife, who was equally confused. Together, they decided this needed to be reported to the authorities in Harper's Mill. The next day, Samuel made the trip to town and sought out the county sheriff, a man named William Thornton. Thornton was an experienced man, approximately 50 years old, and had served as a law enforcement officer in the area for over 2 decades. He listened to Samuel's account with increasing attention, jotting down occasional notes in a worn notebook. 2 days later, Sheriff Thornton organized a small expedition to the Hollowbrook estate. He took with him Samuel Hutchins, the merchant Elijah Porter, who knew Thomas, and 2 other townsmen who would serve as witnesses. The group arrived at the farm on a cloudy March afternoon, and Thornton conducted a meticulous inspection of the entire property. He examined every room in the house, the barn, the well, and the fence lines. His conclusion was essentially the same as Samuel's. The property was completely stripped of any personal belongings or family possessions. But Thornton noticed a few additional details that a less trained observer might have missed. There were no scuff marks on the house's floor that would indicate that heavy furniture had been recently removed. The floorboards showed uniform wear, without the obvious marks furniture leaves when left in the same place for years. The walls lacked the lighter squares typically left when paintings or mirrors are removed after long hanging. It was as if the objects had never been there in the first place, as if the house had always been empty. The sheriff also examined the land surrounding the property. With the snow melting, the ground was exposed and soft. There were no signs of recent disturbance, no areas that suggested anything had been buried. He checked the well, fearing he might find something sinister in its depths, but the water was clear, and there was nothing unusual. The field showed the remains of the last harvest, with corn stumps still visible in neat rows. Everything indicated the farm had been worked normally until the previous fall. Thornton spoke at length with Samuel Hutchins, trying to extract every detail that might be relevant. Samuel described Thomas as a quiet but not hostile man, hard-working and apparently without serious financial problems. Margaret was even more reserved, saying little even when visiting neighbors. Neither of them ever mentioned having family in other areas, nor any plans to move. There were no known debts and no disputes with neighbors, no apparent reason for a sudden disappearance. Shopkeeper Elijah Porter confirmed that Thomas had made that last large purchase in October, but insisted that the man had not appeared disturbed or anxious. He was calm, methodical, simply shopping like any other customer. Porter checked his records and confirmed that Thomas had no outstanding debts in his store. In fact, the Hollowbrooks always paid in cash, never asking for credit. They were reliable, predictable customers, with nothing that distinguished them from dozens of other rural families in the area. Thornton decided to investigate further. He traveled to the county records office, located at the administrative headquarters in Morgantown, approximately 25 miles away. It was a day-long trip in those days, traveled by wagon along the rutted roads that connected the small communities of West Virginia. There, he requested all the documents related to the Hollowbrooks. The clerk in charge, an elderly gentleman named Herbert Gladstone, spent hours searching through the dusty files. What Gladstone found was disturbing in its scarcity. There was a record of the property's purchase in 1894, 8 years earlier. The document showed that Thomas Hollowbrook had acquired 120 acres of land, including the house and barn, from a previous owner named Jonas Whitfield. The price paid was recorded. The transaction appeared legitimate and properly documented. But beyond this single document, there was virtually nothing else. No birth records, no marriage certificates filed with the county, no additional deeds, no wills, no court proceedings. It was as if the Hollowbrooks had materialized in 1894 just to purchase this land. Thornton inquired about Jonas Whitfield, the previous seller of the property. Gladstone checked the records and reported that Whitfield had died in 1897, approximately 3 years after selling the land to the Hollowbrooks. There were no known heirs, and his other assets had been auctioned off to cover some small debts. It was a dead end. The sheriff then asked if there was any record of where Thomas Hollowbrook had lived before arriving in the area. Gladstone leafed through old documents but found nothing. The previous address listed on the purchase deed was simply Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with no further details. Pittsburgh was a large city, especially by the standards of the time. With a population of several 100,000 people, locating information about a man named Thomas Hollowbrook without more details would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. Thornton knew he lacked the resources or authority to conduct an investigation in another state. He returned to Harper's Mill with more questions than answers, carrying with him copies of the few documents Gladstone had managed to locate. Back at his desk in the small office that served as local law enforcement headquarters, Thornton organized everything he knew. A seemingly normal family purchases a rural property in 1894. They live there discreetly, but without problems for 8 years. In the fall of 1920, they make massive purchases of provisions. During the harsh winter, they disappear completely, taking with them all their belongings, including heavy furniture and any personal items. The property sits empty, as if it had never been lived in. There are no signs of violence, no evidence of crime, no body, no witnesses to anything unusual. The sheriff called a meeting of Harper's Mill's most prominent citizens to discuss the case. Among those present were the local church reverend, the town doctor, and some established farmers and merchants. Everyone listened to Thornton's account with interest and concern. Various theories were proposed. Perhaps the Hollowbrooks had secret debts and fled in the middle of the night, but that didn't explain how they managed to remove all their furniture, nor why no creditors were looking for them. Perhaps they had been the victims of some crime, and the perpetrators had cleaned up the scene. but there was no evidence of violence, and removing so many objects would have required multiple trips with wagons, something that would certainly have been noticed. Some have suggested that perhaps the Hollowbrooks never actually lived there the way everyone thought. Perhaps they maintained the property as a front for some unknown purpose. But Samuel Hutchins and others who visited the house testified that it was genuinely inhabited. There was food being prepared, clothes hanging on the line, clear signs of daily life. The town physician, Dr. Franklin Morse, raised the possibility that some illness had struck the family, but acknowledged that this would not explain the complete disappearance of all their belongings. Reverend Andrew Blackwell, a man in his 60s who led the small Methodist congregation at Harper's Mill, offered a different perspective. He recalled that Margaret Hollowbrook had attended Sunday services irregularly over the years. She always sat in the back pews, rarely participated in the after-service conversations, and never offered to help with church activities. The Reverend described her as a tired-looking woman, with eyes that seemed to carry some invisible weight. He had tried on a few occasions to engage her more intimately, asking about her life and offering spiritual support, but Margaret always politely deflected personal questions. Blackwell mentioned a specific incident that occurred approximately a year before her disappearance, during the fall of 1901. After one of the services, Margaret remained seated in the pew, even after all the other worshippers had left. The Reverend approached her and asked if everything was okay. Margaret looked at him with an expression he described as desperate, as if she were about to reveal something important. She opened her mouth to speak, hesitated for several seconds, and then simply stood up, mumbled an apology, and quickly left the church. It was the last time the Reverend saw her. He admitted that moment remained etched in his memory, as he felt he had missed an opportunity to help someone in need. This information intrigued Sheriff Thornton. There was something Margaret wanted to tell him, something that deeply troubled her. But what could it be? He decided to interview others who had had contact with the Hollowbrooks, however briefly. Mrs. Hutchins, Samuel's wife, remembered Margaret's few visits. She described Margaret as polite but distant, always seeming eager to wrap up conversations and return home. On one occasion, when Mrs. Hutchins offered tea and biscuits, Margaret accepted but ate quickly, as if in a hurry or afraid to linger. Another neighbor, a farmer named Robert Finch who lived about 3 miles from the Hollowbrooks, reported seeing Thomas a few times traveling along the main road. Finch described him as a man of medium build, with a dark beard, and always wearing a wide-brimmed hat that partially shaded his face. Thomas never initiated conversations, only waving politely when he passed other travelers. Finch mentioned something interesting. On one occasion during the summer of 1901, he had seen Thomas carrying something heavy wrapped in canvas in the back of his wagon. When Finch asked what he was carrying, Thomas curtly replied that it was farm equipment, and continued on his way without elaborating. Thornton wrote down every detail, no matter how trivial. He was building a profile of the Hollowbrooks, trying to understand who these people were who had lived among them for 8 years, leaving so few traces. The sheriff then decided to do something unusual for the time. He wrote detailed letters describing the case and sent them to sheriffs in neighboring counties, asking if anyone had information about a family named Hollowbrook or similar disappearances. It was a slow process, relying on the Postal Service and the goodwill of other law enforcement officials who already had their own responsibilities. While waiting for answers, Thornton returned repeatedly to the abandoned property. He took different people with him on each visit, hoping fresh eyes might spot something he had missed. On one such expedition, accompanied by a local carpenter named George Williamson, they made a peculiar discovery. Williamson, examining the structure of the house with a professional eye, noticed that a section of floorboards in the master bedroom sounded slightly different when walked on. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible difference, but Williamson had a trained ear for such nuances. They carefully removed some floorboards and discovered a small empty space beneath the floor. It wasn't exactly a secret compartment, but rather a natural gap in the construction, common in houses of that era. Inside this space, Thornton found something unexpected, a small book bound in worn leather. His hands trembled slightly as he removed it. The book was dusty but intact, protected from moisture by the enclosed space. He opened it carefully. The pages were covered in handwriting, a delicate, orderly feminine script. It was a diary. Thornton's heart raced. Finally, something tangible, something that might offer answers. He quickly flipped through the pages, noting that the entries dated back several years. The first entry was from May of 1894, shortly after the Hollowbrooks purchased the property. The last entry was dated September of 192, just a month before the disappearance. The sheriff decided not to read it then and there, but to take the diary back to his office where he could examine it properly under better lighting and with enough time. That evening, sitting at his desk with an oil lamp providing a yellowish glow, William Thornton began reading Margaret Hollowbrook's diary. The early entries were relatively mundane, describing their arrival at the new property, the work of establishing the farm, and their impressions of the region and the weather. Margaret wrote clearly and politely, demonstrating an above-average level of education for rural women of that era. She occasionally mentioned her husband, Thomas, always respectfully but distantly, as if writing about an acquaintance rather than a spouse. As Thornton progressed through the entries, he noticed a gradual shift in tone. Margaret began to express feelings of isolation and loneliness. She wrote about longing for a former life, mentioning places she didn't specifically name and people she didn't identify. There were vague references to better times and choices that can't be undone. The sheriff realized that Margaret was clearly unhappy, but the reasons remained unclear. She never mentioned violence or direct threats, but there was an air of sadness permeating her words. In an entry from November 1896, Margaret wrote something particularly intriguing. "Today marks 2 years since we left our old life behind. Thomas insists it was the only choice, that there was no alternative. I try to believe him, but doubts consume me through the long nights. Did we do the right thing? Did we really have to disappear like that?" The sheriff reread these sentences several times. Disappear like that. So the Hollowbrooks had deliberately abandoned a former life, likely assuming new identities. Other entries reinforced this interpretation. Margaret occasionally mentioned a fear of being found, though she never specified by whom or why. She wrote of recurring nightmares in which people from the past appeared at the farmhouse door. In a particularly revealing passage from March 1898, she noted, "Thomas burned all the old letters today. He said it was necessary, that we couldn't keep anything that connected us to what we were. I wept as I watched the flames consume those words, those memories. It's as if we're erasing ourselves piece by piece until nothing remains but shadows." Thornton continued reading into the night, completely absorbed. The entries became progressively darker as the years passed. Margaret described Thomas as increasingly paranoid, constantly checking the roads, avoiding unnecessary contact with others, and changing his routines without clear explanation. She herself admitted that the life of isolation was taking its toll on her mind, that there were days when she could barely get out of bed, consumed by a profound melancholy. The only solace, she mentioned, was the nature around her, the mountains and forests that offered a quiet beauty amidst her inner torment. The entries from the year 1902 were the most disturbing. In July of that year, Margaret wrote, "Thomas has been awake all night again, sitting by the window with his shotgun in his lap. He won't tell me what he fears, but I see the fear in his eyes. Have they found us? Have they finally located us after all these years?" In August, another entry read, "He talks about leaving again, about abandoning everything and starting over somewhere farther, more remote. I don't know if I have the strength for another change, for another reinvention. I'm tired of running from shadows." The penultimate diary entry was dated September 15th, 1902. Margaret had written, "Thomas has made a decision. He hasn't shared the details with me, but I recognize the determination in his stance. Something is about to happen. I can feel it in my bones. He spent the last few days organizing things, making preparations I don't fully understand. I wonder if we'll finally find peace, whatever that means for us now." The sheriff felt a chill run down his spine as he read those words. There was a resignation there, an acceptance of something inevitable. The final diary entry was the most disconcerting of all. Dated September 28, 1922, Margaret had written in a slightly shakier handwriting than usual, "This will probably be my last entry in this notebook. Thomas told me we need to prepare for a permanent change. He talked about starting completely from scratch, about leaving behind even the names we now carry. He said this time there will be no trace, no trail to follow. I feel fear, but also a strange sense of relief. Maybe it's for the best. Maybe we can finally find some way to exist without constantly looking over our shoulders. May God have mercy on our souls." Thornton closed the diary slowly and sat in silence for long minutes. The lamp flickered softly, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls of the office. What he held in his hands were not answers, but a new set of even deeper mysteries. The Hollowbrooks were clearly on the run from something or someone. They had assumed new identities, destroyed evidence of their past, lived in cautious isolation for 8 years, and then, with planning, they executed a disappearance so complete it seemed impossible. The sheriff tried to reconstruct in his mind what might have happened. Thomas had made those massive purchases in October, enough provisions to last for months, but not to consume them here on the farm, Thornton realized, but rather to sustain them during a long journey or to establish them in a new place. Between October and the onset of winter, they would have had perhaps 4 or 5 weeks of reasonable time before the roads became impassable. Enough time to execute a carefully crafted plan. But how to explain the complete removal of all furniture and belongings? Thornton considered several possibilities. Perhaps Thomas had hired help, workers who came from another region specifically to assist with the move and then left without a trace. But hiring people would involve trust, payments, and records. People would talk, especially in small communities where gossip traveled quickly. There were absolutely no reports of outsiders traveling through the area at that time. Another possibility was that the Hollowbrooks had made multiple trips themselves, gradually transporting their belongings over the course of weeks. But where to? And how could they ensure no one noticed heavily loaded wagons repeatedly coming and going? Samuel Hutchins lived only 2 miles away. He would certainly have noticed unusual movement if it had occurred during the day. At night, it would be even more risky and unlikely, considering the difficulties of navigating poorly lit country roads with heavy loads. There was also the more sinister possibility that Thornton preferred not to consider, but that his logical mind could not ignore. What if the Hollowbrooks hadn't left at all? What if something terrible had happened there, and the scene had been meticulously cleaned to look like a voluntary abandonment? But who would have the motive and the ability to carry out such a thing? And where were the bodies? He had carefully examined the property, including the surrounding grounds. There were no signs of recent burial. The sheriff decided he needed more information about the Hollowbrooks' past before they arrived in West Virginia. The diary mentioned Pittsburgh as their point of origin, or at least as the city listed in the purchase documents. It was a tenuous thread, but it was the only one he had. Thornton wrote a detailed letter to the Pittsburgh Police Department, describing the case and requesting any information about individuals named Thomas or Margaret Hollowbrook, who might have lived there around 1894 or earlier. He also raised the possibility that these were not their real names, describing their physical characteristics as reported by witnesses. Thomas, medium height, medium build, dark beard, brown eyes, approximately 45 years old at the time of disappearance. Margaret, short height, delicate build, brown hair, blue eyes, approximately 40 years old. Thornton knew it was a generic description that could apply to hundreds of people, but it was what he had to work with. Weeks passed without a response from Pittsburgh. During that time, Thornton received a few letters from sheriffs in neighboring counties. None reported similar cases or had any information about the Hollowbrooks. One sheriff in the adjacent county mentioned a 20-year-old case where a family had disappeared under strange circumstances, but the details were different enough to seem unrelated. Another mentioned long-standing rumors about people coming to Appalachia specifically to disappear, seeking the anonymity the remote mountains offered. That last comment resonated with Thornton. The Appalachian region had a long history of serving as a refuge for those seeking to escape their past lives. People fleeing debt, laws, destructive relationships, or simply seeking a fresh start found the isolated mountains a natural sanctuary. The dense forest, deep valleys, scattered communities, and relative absence of centralized authorities created an environment where one could effectively disappear from organized society. Were the Hollowbrooks just another example of this phenomenon? But if they were seeking anonymity and peace, why disappear again after 8 relatively peaceful years? What or who had frightened them so much that they felt the need to make such a radical and complete change? Margaret's diary suggested a fear of being found, but by whom? Creditors, authorities, personal enemies. The lack of specifics made a proper investigation impossible. Thornton shared the diary's contents with a few trusted people in Harper's Mill, keeping copies of the most relevant passages. Reverend Blackwell was particularly moved by reading Margaret's words, especially those that revealed her profound unhappiness and loneliness. He regretted not having been more insistent in offering help when he realized she was troubled. The town physician, Franklin Morse, read the entries with a clinical eye and suggested that Margaret might be suffering from chronic melancholia, a condition that medicine at the time did not yet fully understand. The discovery of the diary sparked renewed interest in the case among residents of Harper's Mill and the surrounding area. Conversations in shops, at church, and at social gatherings frequently returned to the Hollowbrook mystery. Theories proliferated. Some believed Thomas and Margaret were fugitive criminals who had finally managed to escape justice completely. Others thought they were ordinary people, unlucky enough to witness a serious crime and had to go into hiding to protect their lives. Some even suggested more fanciful explanations involving secret cults or mysterious organizations. The spring of 193 turned into summer, and the case remained unsolved. Thornton continued his investigations when time permitted, but his responsibilities as county sheriff were many, and he couldn't devote himself exclusively to the Hollowbrook mystery. The abandoned property remained untouched. No one claimed the land. Technically, because the property taxes weren't being paid, it would eventually revert to the county, but that process would take years. In August 1933, almost a year after the Hollowbrooks' likely disappearance, Thornton finally received a response from Pittsburgh. The letter came from the city's police department, signed by a detective named Richard Coleman. Coleman wrote that he had searched available records, but found no one named Thomas or Margaret Hollowbrook living in Pittsburgh during the relevant period. However, he did mention something interesting. Coleman had shown the physical descriptions and case summary to some veteran officers in the department. One of them, a retired officer named Patrick O'Brien, vaguely recalled an incident that occurred in 1893 or 1894 involving a couple who roughly matched the descriptions. O'Brien couldn't recall specific details, but he had a feeling it was related to some sort of fraud or financial embezzlement. The problem was that records from that period were incomplete. Many documents had been lost in a fire that destroyed part of the department's archives in 1897. Coleman offered to investigate further if Thornton could provide additional information, but admitted that without accurate names or more specific details, it would be extremely difficult to locate relevant documents in the city's vast archives. He also mentioned that if this was indeed a case of fraud or financial crime, the couple would likely have used false names even back then, making the search even more complicated. The information from Pittsburgh, while frustratingly vague, offered at least one possible direction. If the Hollowbrooks had been involved in some sort of financial fraud, it would explain their need to assume new identities and live in seclusion. It would also explain the constant fear of discovery that Margaret had documented in her diary. People involved in large-scale financial crimes often attracted the attention not only of the authorities, but also of angry victims or other criminals interested in the embezzled money. Thornton pondered this possibility. Financial crimes in the 1890s were relatively common in large industrial cities like Pittsburgh. Fraudulent investment schemes, bank embezzlement, and embezzlement of corporate funds. If Thomas Hollowbrook had been a bank clerk or accountant who had embezzled significant sums, he would have had access to resources to finance an elaborate escape and a new life in a remote location. The 8 years they spent on the farm could have been sustained by this hidden money. But there was a problem with this theory. If Thomas truly had access to substantial funds, why did he live so modestly? The Hollowbrook farm was by no means prosperous. It was a small, hard-worked estate, producing only enough for subsistence and occasional small sales. There were no signs of hidden wealth, no discreet luxuries, no extravagances that might betray significant financial resources. They lived like any other poor farming family in the region. Perhaps the modesty was intentional, the sheriff reflected. A way to inconspicuously, to blend in completely with the local population. Someone living far beyond their means in a rural community would immediately raise suspicion. Everyone knew everyone else's financial situation, and unexplained wealth would be noticed and commented on. Living simply and working the land like any other farmer was the perfect camouflage, and if Thomas had buried or hidden the money somewhere, he could access it whenever needed without arousing curiosity. This line of reasoning led Thornton back to the abandoned property. He organized another expedition, this time specifically to search for hiding places or places where something valuable might have been hidden. He took with him 2 experienced construction workers who could identify structural modifications to the house or barn. For 2 days, they examined every inch of the buildings. They checked walls for voids, examined the barn ceiling, and probed the floor for additional compartments beyond the one where the diary had been found. They found little. In the barn, they discovered some old, rusty tools buried shallowly in the dirt floor, likely discarded years earlier by the previous owners. In the house, they found a few loose nails, bits of rotting fabric between the floorboards, and fragments of broken crockery. Nothing that indicated the presence of hidden wealth or offered any clues to the Hollowbrook's fate. The meticulous search consumed time and energy, but yielded disappointing results. Thornton didn't give up. He expanded the search to the land surrounding the buildings. Using shovels and metal rods to probe the soil, the men looked for areas where the earth might have been dug up and reburied. They checked around large trees, near the well, and in the corners of the property where fences met. They worked under the hot summer sun, sweating profusely, driven by the hope of finding something significant. But the soil revealed only rocks, roots, and ordinary earth. No buried chests, no bags of coins, no hidden documents. While the sheriff focused on these physical searches, Reverend Blackwell took a different approach. He began discreetly inquiring through his network of religious contacts, writing letters to other Methodist ministers in various regions of West Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. His strategy was to ask if anyone knew of stories about couples who had mysteriously disappeared or about people living under suspicious identities. It was a long-term approach, but Blackwell felt a personal responsibility for the case, especially after reading Margaret's tormented words in her diary. Answers trickled in over the following months. Most ministers lacked relevant information, but they offered prayers and expressed interest in solving the mystery. Some shared vague stories about congregation members who had abruptly departed, but the details never matched the Hollowbrook case. A minister from a small town in western Pennsylvania mentioned hearing rumors about an informal network of people who helped individuals disappear when their lives were in danger, but admitted it could just be an urban legend with no basis in fact. The autumn of 1903 arrived, marking exactly 1 year since Thomas Hollowbrook had last been seen at Harper's Mill. The change of season brought with it the same palette of golds and reds that had painted the mountains the previous autumn. The trees surrounding the abandoned Hollowbrook estate shed their leaves, which fell gently to form crunchy carpets on the ground. There was something melancholic about the scene, as if nature itself were reflecting the unsolved mystery that loomed over this place. During this period, something unexpected began to happen. Locals began reporting strange experiences when passing near the former Hollowbrook estate. These weren't reports of explicit supernatural phenomena, but rather unsettling, difficult-to-explain sensations. Travelers reported feeling watched when traveling along the road that passed near the farm. Some swore they heard distant sounds coming from the direction of the empty house, as if someone were moving objects or walking through the rooms. Samuel Hutchins reported to the sheriff that on 2 separate occasions during the night, he had seen what appeared to be flickering lights in the direction of the abandoned property. Dim lights, like flashlights or candles, moving between the trees. He hadn't investigated personally out of fear and distance, but he was convinced of what he had seen. Another neighbor, a man named Daniel Crawford, mentioned that his dogs refused to approach the path leading to the Hollowbrook home, barking anxiously whenever he tried to lead them in that direction. Thornton regarded these stories with healthy skepticism. He knew how small communities could amplify rumors, and how the human imagination tended to create patterns where none existed. An unsolved mystery naturally spawned speculation and increasingly elaborate stories. Lights in the darkness could be moonlight reflections in windows, sounds could be twigs snapping or wild animals, and dogs were nervous creatures that reacted to smells and sounds imperceptible to humans. However, he couldn't completely ignore the reports. He decided to hold occasional nightly vigils near the property. On several nights throughout October and November, Thornton positioned himself in strategic locations overlooking the abandoned farmhouse, remaining quiet and observing. He carried a shotgun, not because he believed in ghosts, but because of the possibility of encountering very real human intruders. Perhaps someone was using the empty property for questionable purposes, or perhaps there were people searching for the same hidden treasure he himself suspected. During these vigils, Thornton observed nothing definitively abnormal. The house remained dark and silent, a black silhouette against the night sky. He heard the normal sounds of the forest, owls hooting, small animals moving among the vegetation, the wind whistling through the bare tree branches. On one occasion, he actually saw something that could have been interpreted as light, but realized it was simply moonlight reflecting off a window at a specific angle. Another night, he heard the sounds of wood creaking, but recognized it as the natural noises of an ancient structure responding to changes in temperature. Still, there was something unsettling about standing there alone in the darkness, staring at that house where an entire family had simply ceased to exist. Thornton was not a superstitious man, but even he felt the weight of the unsolved mystery pressing down on his mind. Every shadow seemed to carry sinister possibilities. Every sound suggested disturbing explanations. He understood why people in the area were beginning to avoid the place, why strange stories were beginning to circulate. The winter of 1933 to 1944 was less severe than the previous one, but still brought abundant snow and a piercing cold. The investigation effectively froze along with the ground, as Thornton had other responsibilities and could not dedicate himself exclusively to a case that seemed increasingly impossible to solve. The Hollowbrook estate remained abandoned, slowly beginning to show signs of deterioration. Without maintenance, some roof shingles had come loose, allowing rain and snow to enter. Windows shattered due to the expanding ice. Nature was beginning to reclaim the space that humans had briefly occupied. The spring of 1944 brought with it a completely unexpected development that reignited the Hollowbrook case with renewed intensity. In April of that year, an elderly man named Nathaniel Graves arrived in Harper's Mill from Baltimore, Maryland. Graves was in his 70s, distinguished-looking with white hair and a stooped posture. He approached Sheriff Thornton directly, claiming to have crucial information about the missing family. His arrival caused considerable excitement in the small community, where news of the Hollowbrook mystery was always met with fervent interest. Thornton welcomed Graves into his office and listened attentively as the visitor told his story. Nathaniel explained that he had worked for decades as a lawyer in Baltimore, primarily dealing with estate and inheritance matters. About 2 months ago, he was organizing old files when he came across documents related to a case he had handled in 1893. Reading the names involved, something in his memory had been triggered. He had vaguely recalled hearing about a missing couple in West Virginia named Hollowbrook. He decided to investigate, and his research eventually led him to Harper's Mill. The documents Graves had brought with him told a fascinating story. In 1893, he had represented the interests of a Whitmore family in Baltimore. Jonathan Whitmore was a prosperous merchant who operated an import-export business. He employed several employees, including an accountant named Thomas Ashford and his wife, Margaret Ashford, who worked as a secretary in the office. During a routine audit, a significant discrepancy was discovered in the company's books. Approximately $12,000 were missing, a substantial sum at the time. The initial investigation pointed to Thomas Ashford as the person responsible for the embezzlement. He had access to the funds, was intimately familiar with the accounting systems, and was perfectly positioned to manipulate records. When Jonathan Whitmore confronted Thomas about the irregularities, the accountant vehemently denied any wrongdoing, insisting there must have been some error in the calculations. However, before a more thorough investigation could be conducted, both Thomas and Margaret disappeared. They simply failed to show up for work one day and were never seen again. Whitmore had hired Nathaniel Graves to assist in the search for the couple and the recovery of the stolen funds. Graves worked with Baltimore law enforcement, but the searches yielded no results. Thomas and Margaret Ashford seemed to have completely vanished. There were no travel records, no one had seen them leave, no clues as to their whereabouts. Whitmore eventually had to accept the loss of the money, adjust his business affairs, and move on. The case remained technically open, but with no new developments, it gradually faded into oblivion. Graves opened a worn leather folder and removed some old photographs. They were formal images, the kind taken in photography studios of the time. One showed a serious-looking man in a dark suit, with a neatly trimmed beard and intense eyes. The other showed a delicate-featured woman in a high-collared dress, her hair elegantly tied back. Thornton examined the photographs carefully, mentally comparing them with the physical descriptions he had collected of the Hollowbrooks. The similarities were undeniable. The facial structure, the apparent height, the physical details, all matched. The sheriff felt a mixture of excitement and satisfaction. Finally, after months of frustrating investigation, he had something concrete. The Hollowbrooks were actually Thomas and Margaret Ashford, runaways from Baltimore, who had stolen a considerable sum and rebuilt their lives in the isolated Appalachian region. This explained the constant fear, the seclusion, and the paranoia documented in Margaret's diary. They weren't fleeing vague dangers or imaginary threats, but rather the legal consequences of a real financial crime. Graves shared additional details he had about the couple. Thomas Ashford came from a lower middle-class family and had worked hard to obtain an education and establish himself as a competent accountant. Margaret came from similar backgrounds, and they had both married young. By all appearances, they were normal, hard-working people until the time of the embezzlement. There was no history of prior criminal behavior, no sign of trouble that could have predicted the theft. This made the crime even more intriguing. What had driven a seemingly honest couple to commit fraud and flee? Thornton speculated that perhaps they had faced some desperate financial crisis, hidden debts, unexpected medical expenses, or perhaps simply the lure of a better life. $12,000 in 1893 was a fortune that could sustain a person comfortably for many years if managed carefully. But the Ashfords, now living as Hollowbrook, had not used the money to live lavishly. Instead, they purchased a modest farm and lived frugally. This suggested some level of conscience, perhaps even regret. The question remained, where were they now? If Thomas had carefully planned the first Baltimore disappearance, he certainly had the skill to plan a second. But this time, he didn't just have to disappear. He had to make an entire property appear as if it had never been lived in. How had he accomplished this? And more importantly, where had they gone? Graves had no answers to these questions, but he offered to help in any way he could. He would stay at Harper's Mill for a few days, available for consultations. Thornton took advantage of Graves's presence to thoroughly review everything they knew about the case. Together, they pored over Margaret's diary again, this time with the knowledge of her true past. The entries took on new meaning. When Margaret had written about choices that cannot be undone, she was clearly referring to the theft and escape. Her references to being found made sense now. It was the legitimate fear that the authorities or agents hired by Whitmore would locate them. Thomas's paranoia, constantly checking roads and avoiding social contact, was the rational precaution of a wanted man. The lawyer also examined the property's purchase documents. He noticed something Thornton had seen, but not fully understood. The price paid for the farm in 1894 was $2,500, a substantial but not exorbitant sum for a property of that size. If Thomas had indeed had access to 12,000 stolen dollars, he would have spent approximately one-fifth of it on the land purchase. That would leave $9,500 remaining, a still considerable fortune. Where was that money now? If Thomas had taken it with him when he disappeared again, he would have had more than enough resources to start over anywhere, perhaps even leave the country. With fake identities and cash in hand, they could have gone to Canada, Mexico, or even embarked for Europe. The possibilities were endless. On the other hand, if the money had been hidden somewhere on the property or nearby, it might still be there, waiting to be discovered. This possibility prompted additional searches. Graves and Thornton returned to the abandoned farmhouse, now with a new purpose. The lawyer, despite his advanced age, insisted on participating in the search. They re-examined all the obvious locations, then expanded to less likely areas. They checked the well's interior more meticulously, using ropes to descend to the bottom and examine the stones that formed its walls. They found only cold, clear water, with no secret compartments or hidden objects. They surveyed the ground around the house in systematic patterns, marking areas already checked to avoid duplication of effort. The exhaustive search lasted 4 full days. Other volunteers from Harper's Mill joined the effort, motivated by the possibility of finding the lost money. There was even speculation about a reward Jonathan Whitmore might offer for the recovery of his stolen funds, though Graves made no promises. The property was literally torn apart, every structure examined, every corner investigated. They found occasional worthless objects, rusted tools, pieces of broken pottery, but no hidden treasure. Frustration was palpable when it became clear that the money wasn't hidden on the property, or at least not anywhere it could be easily found. Graves suggested that Thomas might never have brought the entirety of the funds to West Virginia. It was possible he had deposited some of the money in banks under false names in different cities along his escape route, creating a network of accessible but difficult-to-trace assets. This strategy would have been smart, spreading the risk and ensuring that even if one hiding place was discovered, others would remain intact. Thornton considered this possibility and realized it made the investigation even more complex. Tracing bank accounts under false names without knowing which names were used or at which institutions would be virtually impossible with the resources available in 1904. The banking system at the time lacked the centralization or communication mechanisms that would allow coordinated searches across different states. Each bank operated independently, and customer privacy was strictly protected. Before leaving Harper's Mill, Nathaniel Graves made one last significant contribution to the case. He suggested that Thornton attempt to locate travel records from the time the Ashfords disappeared from Baltimore, railroad stations, stagecoach companies, port records, any documentation that might indicate where a couple traveling in October 1893 might have gone. It was a monumental task, but Graves offered to utilize his own contacts in Baltimore to begin the search. He would leave the following morning, but would maintain regular correspondence with the sheriff. After Graves left Harper's Mill, Thornton reflected on everything he had learned. Now he knew who the Hollowbrooks really were, the reason for their original escape, and had a much better understanding of their circumstances. But he still didn't have the answer to the fundamental question. Where had they gone, and how had they managed to disappear so completely a second time? This question continued to haunt him, occupying his thoughts during the long nights when he should have been resting. A theory began to form in his mind. Thomas Ashford was clearly a meticulous and intelligent man. He had planned and executed a complex financial embezzlement, escaped a major city without a trace, established a convincing new identity, and lived discreetly for 8 years without detection. A man with such skills would surely have planned an escape route in case his location was compromised. Perhaps he had prepared a second disappearance as a contingency from the beginning. This would explain the unusual amount of provisions Thomas had purchased in October 1922. These weren't just winter supplies, but preparations for a long and carefully planned journey. Perhaps he had spent the previous months gradually removing items from the house, moving them to some intermediate location where they could be temporarily stored. Then, in a series of nighttime trips or during periods when he knew he wouldn't be observed, he transported everything away. The property was deliberately emptied so that it would appear as if it had never been lived in, confounding any subsequent investigation. But where would they take all those belongings, and why bother removing them? Why not simply leave everything behind, as most fugitives do? Thornton realized that perhaps the answer lay in the need to completely erase any evidence of their lives there. Personal documents, letters, photographs, any object that could be traced back to their true identities, needed to be eliminated. And Thomas was cautious enough not to simply burn everything on the property, as ashes and remains might be examined. Better to remove everything completely. As for the furniture and common household objects, perhaps Thomas would have sold them discreetly in distant towns where he wouldn't be recognized. A wagon load of used furniture visiting different communities over the course of weeks or months wouldn't attract particular attention. People constantly sold belongings when they needed money or were moving. He could have disassembled the larger pieces of furniture, making them easier to transport, and sold them piece by piece at regional markets and fairs. The money he earned would have been additional, though minimal, compared to the stolen funds he already had. This theory made sense to Thornton, but it was impossible to verify without the resources to investigate dozens of small communities across multiple counties. He would have to rely on luck or on someone eventually recognizing the Ashfords if they showed up somewhere. The sheriff sent circulars to police departments in several states, including detailed physical descriptions and the photographs Graves had left with him. He included both the names Hollowbrook and Ashford, warning that the couple were likely now using completely different identities. The following months brought some responses to the circulars, but none led to concrete developments. A sheriff in Tennessee reported seeing a couple who might have matched the descriptions, but when investigated, they turned out to be different people with verifiable histories in the area. Another report came from Ohio, equally promising initially but eventually dismissed after investigation. There were simply too many middle-aged couples living modest lives across the country. With no truly distinctive physical characteristics or identifiable marks, it was nearly impossible to confirm identities based solely on general appearance. Nathaniel Graves maintained regular correspondence as promised. In June of 1944, he wrote reporting that he had located some railroad records from October of 1893. There was a record of tickets purchased for a couple traveling from Baltimore to Pittsburgh, with names that could potentially be aliases used by the Ashfords. The names were John and Mary Thompson, too common to allow definitive tracing, but the date of the trip, October 23rd, corresponded to the time of the disappearance. From Pittsburgh, the trail went completely cold. There were no subsequent records that could be definitively linked to the fugitives. This information reinforced the Pittsburgh connection that had already appeared in the West Virginia property purchase documents. Apparently, the Ashfords had indeed passed through that city during their escape, possibly staying there for some time, before eventually reaching the Appalachian region. Pittsburgh was an industrial and transportation hub, a place where strangers constantly arrived and departed. It would be relatively easy for a couple to get lost in the urban crowd while planning their next move. Thornton shared these discoveries with the Harper's Mill community. The Hollowbrook mystery had become more than just a local curiosity. It had become part of the area's identity, a story people told and retold, each time adding new details and speculation. The abandoned property had gained a sinister reputation. Young people from the town dared each other to approach the house after dark, testing their courage. Stories of mysterious lights and unexplained sounds continued to circulate, though Thornton remained skeptical about their veracity. In the fall of 1944, 2 full years after the Hollowbrooks' disappearance, Thornton had to accept a harsh reality. With no new developments or significant leads, the case was effectively stagnant. He had done everything he could with the resources at his disposal. He had identified the true identities of the missing, discovered the reason for their original escape, and constructed reasonable theories about how they might have perpetrated their second disappearance. But actually, locating Thomas and Margaret Ashford was beyond his capabilities. The sheriff continued his other responsibilities, but kept the Hollowbrook case technically open. He periodically reviewed the files, hoping some forgotten detail might suddenly make sense, or that new information might emerge from an unexpected source. He maintained correspondence with Nathaniel Graves, who also continued to occasionally search for clues in Baltimore. Jonathan Whitmore, the robbed merchant, had already died in 1903, so there was no longer a direct client seeking justice in the case, but Graves felt a professional obligation to try to solve the mystery. The Hollowbrook estate continued its slow decline. The legal process to revert the land to the county for unpaid taxes moved at the speed characteristic of the bureaucracy of the time. Eventually, in 1966, the property was officially repossessed by the county and put up for public auction. A local farmer purchased it at a reduced price, planning to tear down the dilapidated house and incorporate the land into his adjacent property. Thus, the last physical traces of the Hollowbrooks' presence began to be erased from the landscape. Before the demolition, Thornton made one last visit to the house. He walked through the empty, decaying rooms, now with a partially collapsed roof and walls stained by water infiltration. He tried to imagine Thomas and Margaret living there, maintaining a semblance of normalcy while carrying the weight of their secrets. He thought of Margaret perhaps sitting in that corner, writing in her diary by candlelight, pouring out her anguish on pages that would only be read after she disappeared. He thought of Thomas planning meticulously, always calculating, always preparing for the moment when they would have to flee again. There was something deeply sad about that empty house, not just because of the unsolved mystery, but because of what it represented about the human condition. 2 people who had made a mistake, a crime perhaps motivated by desperation or greed, and then spent years living with the consequences, never finding peace, always looking over their shoulders, unable to build genuine connections with others for fear of revealing too much. What kind of existence was that? Was it truly better than facing justice and paying for their crimes? Years passed, and the Hollowbrook case gradually transitioned from active investigation to the status of an unsolved historical mystery. Thornton retired as sheriff in 1911, after nearly 3 decades of serving the community. In his final days in office, he meticulously organized all documents related to the case, including Margaret's diary, photographs provided by Nathaniel Graves, copies of all correspondence, and his own detailed notes. Everything was carefully archived in the county office, preserved for future generations who might have better resources to solve the mystery. Before officially handing over his position, Thornton wrote a comprehensive final report on the case. In it, he chronologically documented everything he had uncovered, from Samuel Hutchins's first report of the empty property to the final, unsuccessful attempts to locate the fugitives. He presented his theories about how the disappearance might have been carried out, but was careful to clearly identify them as speculation based on limited evidence. The report concluded with a list of unanswered questions that remained plaguing him even after years of investigation. Where exactly did Thomas and Margaret Ashford go after leaving West Virginia? Did they assume new identities for the third time and settle somewhere far away, perhaps in the American West, where territories were still relatively wild and records scarce? Or perhaps they crossed international borders, starting entirely new lives in Canada, Mexico, or even beyond. With their financial resources, virtually any destination was possible. They could have been living comfortably in some prosperous city, having finally allowed themselves to enjoy the money they had stolen. Another possibility Thornton considered, but rarely mentioned publicly, was more bleak. What if something had gone wrong during the execution of the second disappearance? Travel in those days was dangerous, especially through mountainous terrain during the fall and winter. Accidents happened, wagons overturned in ravines. People got lost in dense forests, and sudden illnesses could be fatal, far from medical care. It was conceivable that Thomas and Margaret had perished in some remote location during their escape, their bodies never found, their possessions scattered or lost. This theory would explain why they were never seen or identified anywhere again, despite widely distributed circulars and years of casual surveillance by law enforcement officials in multiple states. It would explain the absolute silence, the complete absence of any clue as to their whereabouts. But it was only speculation, impossible to confirm or refute without concrete evidence. Thornton preferred to imagine that somehow, somewhere, they had found the peace Margaret so longed for in her writings. The Harper's Mill community never completely forgot the story. It became part of local folklore, told on winter evenings when families gathered around fireplaces. Over the decades, the details were distorted, fanciful elements added, until the true story was partially obscured by layers of embellishment. Some versions portrayed Thomas as a ruthless criminal and Margaret as his unwilling victim. Others reversed the roles, suggesting that Margaret had been the mastermind behind the theft. There were even versions that completely ignored the embezzlement aspect, transforming the mystery into something purely supernatural. Samuel Hutchins, the neighbor who first discovered the empty property, lived until 1923. In his later years, he often retold the story to anyone who would listen, always beginning with the description of that spring morning when he rode to the neighbor's farm and found that unsettling stillness. He insisted he had never felt anything like that silence, an absence so complete it seemed unnatural. Even decades later, the memory still haunted him, remaining vivid when so many others had faded with age. Nathaniel Graves continued his sporadic attempts to track down the Ashfords until his own death in 1912. In his final letters to Thornton, the elderly lawyer admitted that the case had become almost a personal obsession. He recognized the irony of devoting so much time and energy to a relatively minor crime, while much larger frauds occurred regularly without consequences. But there was something about the sheer mystery, about the Ashfords' ability to simply vanish without a trace, that captured his imagination and refused to release it. The subsequent decades brought dramatic changes to the Appalachian region and the country as a whole. Industrialization accelerated, roads improved, and communications became faster and more widespread. The law enforcement system developed, investigative techniques advanced, and records were centralized. In many ways, it became increasingly difficult for someone to simply disappear the way Thomas and Margaret Ashford had managed. But at that time, on the threshold of the 20th century, it was still possible for determined and intelligent individuals to completely escape their former lives. The land where the Hollowbrook house once stood was incorporated into the adjacent farm and used for farming. The stone foundations of the old house remained visible for many years, gradually being covered by vegetation until only those familiar with the history knew where to look. The barn was dismantled and its wood reused in other buildings. The well was filled with stone and earth for safety. Over time, the landscape absorbed all physical signs that a family named Hollowbrook had once lived there. County archives preserved the documents related to the case, though accessing them required specific knowledge of where to look and persistence in navigating antiquated cataloging systems. Occasionally, over the decades, researchers interested in historical crimes or unsolved mysteries stumbled upon the story and attempted their own investigations. Some published articles in regional newspapers or magazines specializing in local history. Each generation rediscovered the mystery, examining it with fresh eyes and contemporary tools, but none managed to add definitive answers to the fundamental questions. In the mid-20th century, when modern forensic techniques were well established, there was a brief attempt to re-evaluate the case using scientific methodologies. An enthusiastic investigator obtained permission to examine the land where the Hollowbrook estate had once stood, using metal detectors and other tools in the hope of finding buried objects that might provide clues. The search yielded some interesting finds: ancient coins, rusted tools, and fragments of pottery, but nothing that offered insight into the final fate of the occupants. Analysis of Margaret's diary, using modern document analysis techniques, confirmed its authenticity, written by a single female hand over several years. Experts in handwriting analysis and psychology examined the entries, attempting to construct more detailed profiles of Margaret and, by extension, Thomas. The conclusions generally confirmed what Thornton had already intuited. Margaret was an educated, deeply unhappy woman living under constant psychological stress. Thomas emerged as a controlling, paranoid, meticulously organized figure, but these analyses didn't answer where they went or what happened to them. In the early 21st century, with the advent of the internet and digitized databases, new generations of amateur investigators turned their attention to the case. Online forums dedicated to unsolved historical mysteries debated theories, shared digitized documents from county archives, and attempted to track down possible Ashford descendants who might have family information passed down through the generations. Genealogists pored over records, searching for connections, but the trail always ran cold in 1902, that autumn when Thomas and Margaret simply ceased to exist in official records. Reflecting on this case more than a century after its beginning, we are confronted with questions that transcend the specific details. This is a story about identity, about how much of who we are is tied to the names we bear, the places we live, the records we leave behind. Thomas and Margaret Ashford achieved something remarkable and disturbing. They almost completely erased themselves from history. They demonstrated that even in an increasingly documented and interconnected society, it was still possible, with sufficient planning and determination, to simply disappear. But at what cost? Margaret's diary reveals the emotional and psychological toll of this choice: the loneliness, the constant fear, the inability to form genuine connections, the perpetual need for vigilance. They traded legal consequences for a different, self-imposed prison, perhaps more cruel in its invisible nature. Were years of anonymous freedom superior to facing justice and eventually rebuilding lives with legitimate identities? This question has no definitive answer, but it invites us to ponder choices, consequences, and the nature of redemption. The Hollowbrook estate where they lived remains part of the Appalachian landscape, silent about the secrets it once held. The mountains continue to stand like ancient guardians, their dense forests holding mysteries that may never be fully revealed. Somewhere, possibly in records yet undiscovered, or in family memories passed down through generations, may lie the final answer to Thomas and Margaret's fate. Or perhaps they achieved exactly what they set out to do: disappear so completely that not even time can find them. This case reminds us of the fragility of our documented existences, of how fine the line is between being present in society's records and simply not existing for practical purposes. It also illustrates the human capacity for reinvention, for better or worse. Thomas and Margaret Ashford became the Hollowbrooks, and then became no one, or perhaps someone completely different somewhere we will never know. They are simultaneously real and ghosts, people who lived and breathed but left only shadows and questions. If you've made it this far on this journey through one of the most intriguing mysteries of the Northern Appalachians, I hope you've enjoyed not only the story itself, but also the deeper reflections it provokes. This channel is dedicated to exploring these cases that defy simple explanations, that make us question what we think we know about human nature and reality itself. If this story touched you in any way, consider subscribing to follow more investigations into the unknown. Leave your own theories about what might have happened to the Ashfords in the comments, and if you know of other historical mysteries that deserve attention, share them with us. Until the next journey into the dark side of history.